Hey guys, we're going to do a short video today about the transcendental argument for God's existence, just a summary of the argument and sort of what it entails to make it a little bit easier when you're trying to communicate these things, because most people don't think in terms of transcendental categories, because this is the transcendental argument. People want you to prove God in a certain way. And what we're claiming is, and what's reasonable, is that the nature of what you're trying to prove would dictate the types of evidences that are required to prove that claim. And when it comes to God, the Christian God, we're claiming that God is transcendent, like He is a necessary being. And so you would have to look for transcendental evidences, and one of the evidences would be transcendental would be laws of logic and mathematics. These are necessary preconditions for every thought, for intelligibility, for any statement of meaning. You have to assume laws of logic and math, and you assume them in a particular way. You assume them to be universal, invariant. They don't change. They're infallible. They're going to be they apply all through history, because people pass judgments on, historical events, and they're infinite. These laws will be infinite. They're immaterial, and they're conceptual laws. They're laws that you apprehend mentally. And so, what would be required to account for these things? The only thing that makes sense is that there would be a universal, invariant, infallible, immaterial, infinite mind to account for these, for the existence of these categories, And so when it comes to laws of logic and math, we're assuming that there is the existence of these laws that are independent of us. We didn't create them. And so they would have to depend upon or be grounded upon or be justified in that way by the Christian God, and so, when you're reasoning with unbelievers and you're trying to help them understand the transcendental argument, it's not one particular thing; it's an entire worldview. So generally, the transcendental argument will break up into three types of laws. You've got the mathematical, logical laws, and you've got moral laws, and then you have laws of physics. And there are different types of laws, but yet they all point to the grounding, the foundation of these laws is always the Christian God, but it's the totality, the sum of all of them that we're arguing. So you end up in a form of argument that is in effect you're arguing worldviews, which is circular by nature. Every argument when it comes to a worldview level or a philosophical level assumes the philosophy to try to make sense of things. So to get to offer evidences to people, they would just interpret it within the framework of their presuppositions, within their worldview. And so in order to interact with this type of argumentation, you have to bring it to a worldview level, which is not a circular, question-begging type of a fallacy. It's a self-evidence, self-authenticating circle, if you will. And everybody has to assume that. It's kind of like if you say, how do you prove laws of logic? Well, you assume laws of logic to prove them, but that doesn't invalidate them. It doesn't mean that they're self-contradictory. So that's the type of argument that you're engaged in. And if you go with the laws of logic, that's the way you go with it, with the nature of those laws. And a lot of times your opponents who reject Christianity are going to use logic as if it is universal, invariant, immaterial. It applies all through history, all over the universe, and it's infinite. And they're going to use it in that way. And they might say stuff like, "Well, I don't need to justify the laws of logic in order to use them." And that's not our claim. We're claiming you ought to be able to use the laws of logic in our worldview because you've been designed by God. You're made in the image of God, and He has created you in a way with a mind and He obligates you to be rational. And so you should be rational in our worldview. But what we're claiming is, on the basis of your worldview, rationality can't be justified. It's nonsensical in an alternate worldview. So you have to go, each worldview one by one. So, that would kind of classify laws of logic or mathematics. Then you get into laws of physics, science or physical laws, which are basically reveal God's omnipotence, that He is putting this in order and intentionality, this teleology, onto the created world with an intention, and so it's not just a matter of having a force. You've got an intentionality. You've got a person behind this. If it's just forces, then you have the problem of how can you know this? There's no, how can forces communicate to you? How would you know that forces can't change? You couldn't know this. So it requires a person in the back of these physical laws to make sense of them. And the same thing with moral laws. You've got a lawgiver, one that obligates people to behave a certain way, and when people criticize God or criticize anything else as immoral, or saying He shouldn't have done or ought not to have done X, Y, or Z, they're assuming the nature of moral laws as if they're independent of us, or objective, and they're not just subjective, what I personally like or don't like. So these are kind of the categories that you're going to encounter, and what we're claiming is that whatever statement you're making about anything, these transcendental categories are always assumed by anyone trying to make any intelligible statement, any meaningful thought. They assume the laws of logic in a particular way. They assume laws of physics, uniformity in nature and causation. They assume them to be unchanging, and so Christianity brings these things together, can make sense of them, because there's sensibility contained within the universe, not because the universe communicated these things to you, or not because the laws of logic communicated these things to us. The laws of logic are not personal, not because the laws of physics told us. The laws of physics are not personal, but you can make sense of it by bringing in the designer, the creator, that He made us in His image, and He made it to where we can reason in His world, make sense of His world. He can communicate information to us. So these categories are unexplainable apart from the Christian faith, and so that's sort of what we're doing here. We're saying that God is so necessary. He's such a necessary being that you can't even think a single thought without dependence upon Him, because thought itself presupposes these transcendental categories: logic, math, uniformity in nature, morality. These are all necessary to form thoughts, and so that's why God is a transcendental, has a transcendental necessity about Him. And to reject Him is to disconnect yourself from the grounding, the basis for these categories. And so, whatever worldview you're encountering, you have to pose these things to them, and they have to justify how their worldview can make sense of these immaterial, universal, abstract, infinite, infallible types of laws that are conceptual laws and that don't change, and that have this intentionality imposed upon them, apart from an omnipotent, omniscient God that has a design that He's revealed, a God that cannot lie, a God that's eternal and that's unchanging, and that's the Christian view of God. So it's necessary. So work your way through some of these things, and and try to familiarize yourself with how the conversations will go. Whatever direction, whether it's laws of logic and math, whether it's laws of physics, science, or whether it's moral laws and those types of things, and get grounded in the theology and the biblical teaching about these categories, and that should be adequate for you to be able to cast down the imaginations that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God, thoughts that are contrary to God, bringing them into captivity to the obedience that's to be given to Christ. So that's what our obligations are as defenders of the faith. So, all right, let me know what you think in the comments below, Frank.